There comes a moment in life when exhaustion is no longer physical, but existential. You have worked harder, learned more, tried to become better, and yet something subtle inside you still whispers that it is not enough, not disciplined enough, not evolved enough, not deserving enough. Beneath the pursuit of prosperity, there is often an invisible contract you made long ago. One day, when I become worthy, abundance will finally arrive. And that silent agreement has been shaping your financial reality more than any strategy, skill, or opportunity ever could. Many people who seek prosperity are not driven by greed, but by a deep longing for safety, validation, and internal relief. What hurts is not the absence of money itself, but the constant internal tension of feeling behind, inadequate, or spiritually misaligned. You may meditate, visualize, affirm, and study, yet still sense resistance when imagining financial stability. That resistance is not a lack of effort. It is the nervous system protecting an identity built around struggle. Dr. Joe Dispenza often speaks about how the body becomes conditioned to the emotions of the past, repeating them until they feel like personality. If your system has been rehearsing stress, survival, and striving for decades, prosperity may feel unfamiliar, even unsafe. Napoleon Hill described desire as powerful, but he also warned that belief is what sustains manifestation. And belief cannot coexist with internal self-rejection. This is not about deserving more. It is about permitting yourself to exist without the subconscious need to earn your worth through exhaustion. Prosperity does not respond to self-punishment. It responds to coherence. And coherence begins when you stop negotiating your value and start expanding your internal capacity to receive. There is a subtle fatigue that accumulates when effort becomes identity. For many adults who have carried responsibility for years, prosperity is not blocked by lack of competence, but by a nervous system that equates financial expansion with danger. The body does not interpret money as numbers, it interprets it as change, and change to a system conditioned by uncertainty or instability feels threatening. What appears externally as a financial plateau is often internally a biological defense mechanism repeating familiar chemistry. The brain's survival circuits, especially the amygdala, are designed to prioritize predictability over growth. If your early experiences associated money with conflict, tension, guilt, or power imbalance, your subconscious may still be protecting you from exceeding those emotional thresholds. In that sense, your financial ceiling is not imposed by the market but by memory. Even when consciously you desire abundance, the body may contract at the idea of stability, visibility, or increased responsibility. That contraction is rarely acknowledged because it hides behind the language of trying harder. What complicates this further is identity. If you have spent decades proving your value through struggle, sacrifice, and resilience, prosperity can feel disorienting. The internal narrative may whisper that ease equals laziness, or that financial growth threatens belonging. Bruce Lipton's work on epigenetics suggests that inherited beliefs and environmental conditioning influence not only thought patterns, but biological expression. If scarcity was normalized in your family system, surpassing it can feel like betrayal rather than achievement. The nervous system prefers loyalty to expansion. There are individuals who repeatedly reach a certain income level and unconsciously destabilize it. A sudden expense appears. A business opportunity collapses. Motivation fades at critical moments. This is not mystical punishment. It is pattern preservation. When financial growth exceeds one's internal sense of worth or safety, the psyche recalibrates back to familiarity. The body, addicted to the chemistry of striving, recreates struggle because it recognizes it as home. Prosperity therefore becomes less about acquisition and more about tolerance. Can you tolerate receiving without immediately compensating through overwork? Can you remain regulated when imagining consistent income rather than fluctuating survival? The discomfort that arises in those reflections reveals the true work. It is not a matter of earning more, but expanding capacity. Imagine a room that has been dimly lit for years. When light enters suddenly, dust becomes visible. Prosperity functions similarly. It illuminates unresolved beliefs about power, responsibility, and visibility. Many people unconsciously fear what abundance might expose about them: old insecurities, hidden ambitions, or unresolved family dynamics. So the system maintains modest limitation, to avoid psychological confrontation. Allowing prosperity requires becoming aware of the emotional micro-reactions that occur when you envision financial stability. Does your breath shorten? Does your chest tighten? Do thoughts of "what if I fail" surface instantly? These responses are data. They reveal where expansion meets stored memory. When you learn to observe these reactions without judgment, you begin separating present possibility from past imprint. In quantum language, people often speak about vibration and frequency, but rarely about regulation. A coherent state is not achieved through intensity. It is achieved through alignment between thought, emotion, and physiology. If your body remains in survival mode, affirmations cannot override chemistry. The first layer of prosperity is internal safety. Allowing, then, is not passive. It is the disciplined cultivation of nervous system stability in the presence of growth. It is the willingness to sit with the unfamiliar sensation of ease without sabotaging it. When your internal environment becomes less hostile to expansion, opportunities no longer trigger defense. They trigger discernment, and discernment, unlike fear, does not contract. It expands with clarity. There is a misunderstood belief deeply embedded in the collective psyche. Prosperity must be morally justified. Many individuals unconsciously equate financial growth with proof of virtue, discipline, or spiritual maturity. As a result, they approach abundance as if it were a reward granted after sufficient suffering. This moral framework quietly distorts the relationship with money, turning prosperity into a test rather than a natural consequence of internal alignment. When abundance becomes a prize for endurance, the nervous system remains locked in effort, unable to relax into reception. The brain, particularly through dopamine regulation, reinforces cycles of anticipation and tension. When financial stability feels distant, the pursuit itself generates stimulation. The chase becomes chemically familiar. Ironically, when opportunities arise that promise consistency rather than adrenaline, the system may resist them. Stability lacks the emotional spikes the brain has rehearsed for years. What many interpret as lack of motivation is often a subconscious preference for emotional intensity over sustainable growth. Control further complicates this dynamic. The desire to micromanage every outcome is usually disguised as responsibility, but at its core it reflects mistrust. Urgency is frequently mistaken for productivity. When the mind constantly scans for future threats or potential losses, it sustains a vibrational pattern of scarcity. This is not about mystical frequency, it is about physiological coherence. Joe Dispenza emphasizes the synchronization between heart and brain as a measurable state of alignment. When thought and emotion contradict each other, when one visualizes prosperity but feels anxiety, the body broadcasts inconsistency. Visualization alone cannot override emotional memory. If imagining financial abundance triggers subtle fear, fear of higher expectations, exposure, or increased responsibility, the body signals caution. Many adults who have carried heavy emotional loads equate expansion with burden. The internal narrative may suggest that more money means more demands, more visibility, or greater risk of failure. Consequently, the system chooses moderation as a protective strategy. There is also a hidden fear of permanence. Fluctuation, though stressful, feels familiar. Stability introduces a different psychological demand: maintenance. To sustain prosperity requires identity evolution. It challenges long-held self-concepts rooted in struggle. If someone has defined themselves as resilient because of hardship, what happens when hardship decreases? Who are they without the narrative of overcoming? These identity shifts are rarely acknowledged, yet they significantly influence financial patterns. The concept of allowing is often misunderstood as passive surrender. In reality, it involves internal recalibration. It means reducing physiological resistance when imagining consistent inflow. It means tolerating the quiet that follows financial order instead of unconsciously creating chaos to reintroduce familiar stimulation. Allowing requires subtle emotional maturity, the capacity to remain steady when circumstances improve. Consider the image of a seed pressed into soil. If one were to dig it up repeatedly to check its growth, the process would be disrupted. Excessive control mirrors that behavior. It communicates distrust in natural unfolding. Yet trust is not blind faith. It is regulated presence. When the nervous system is calm, decisions become strategic rather than reactive. Opportunities are evaluated with clarity instead of urgency. Prosperity begins to shift when the internal environment becomes less antagonistic toward ease. Ease does not imply complacency, it reflects coherence. When effort is no longer fueled by fear of inadequacy, action becomes cleaner, more precise. Financial decisions are no longer attempts to compensate for self-doubt, but expressions of alignment. The paradox is that many people work tirelessly to deserve abundance, while unconsciously rejecting the very stability they seek. The transition from striving to allowing is subtle, but transformative. It is not about diminishing ambition, it is about dissolving the emotional friction that sabotages sustainability. When the body no longer associates prosperity with threat, opportunities cease to trigger contraction. They become invitations rather than tests. And within that shift, the flow of financial energy stabilizes, not because it was forced, but because it was finally permitted. Expansion carries a cost that is rarely discussed. It demands psychological elasticity. Many individuals claim they desire prosperity, yet internally they are structured around survival. Survival is tight, vigilant, and hyper-aware. Prosperity, in contrast, requires spaciousness. It requires the capacity to remain centered when outcomes shift upward. This is where tension often emerges. The nervous system, conditioned by years of anticipation and guardedness, interprets expansion as destabilization. Growth stretches identity, and identity resists alteration. There is a subtle impatience that accompanies financial longing. It disguises itself as determination, yet beneath it lies anxiety. Anxiety attempts to control time. It wants assurance that effort will convert into results within predictable intervals. When outcomes do not conform to that internal timeline, frustration intensifies. That frustration reinforces the belief that something is missing or insufficient. However, the deeper issue is not timing. It is attachment to control. Attempting to regulate the speed of manifestation often reinforces scarcity consciousness because it signals mistrust in unfolding processes. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes relevant here. The shadow does not only contain repressed weaknesses, it also contains unclaimed power. Many individuals unconsciously fear their own expansion. Financial growth may increase visibility, influence, or authority. If earlier life experiences associated visibility with criticism or responsibility with pressure, prosperity may activate old emotional imprints. The psyche, seeking safety, may subtly avoid opportunities that threaten to expose those dormant fears. This avoidance rarely appears dramatic. It manifests as hesitation, procrastination, or indecision at pivotal moments. Identity is central to sustainable prosperity. If a person internally identifies as someone who struggles nobly, sudden ease disrupts self-concept. There can be guilt associated with surpassing family norms or cultural expectations. In some systems, modesty is equated with virtue, and financial ambition is perceived as arrogance. These inherited narratives shape internal dialogue. Even when consciously rejected, they linger in subconscious layers. Expansion then feels like disloyalty rather than achievement. There is also the dimension of responsibility. Financial stability brings choices. Choices demand discernment. Discernment requires emotional regulation. When someone has lived in reactive mode for years, the calm space that prosperity creates can feel unfamiliar. Silence replaces chaos. Stability replaces urgency. Without inner grounding, this quiet may feel uncomfortable. The mind may unconsciously generate new problems to restore the chemistry of busyness. In this way, self-sabotage is not intentional destruction, but an attempt to return to emotional familiarity. Quantum language often speaks about collapsing possibilities into reality, yet collapse requires focus free from fragmentation. When the mind oscillates between desire and doubt, the internal signal becomes incoherent. The body cannot embody a future it does not feel safe inhabiting. Emotional tolerance becomes the true gateway. Can you emotionally inhabit the version of yourself who manages abundance without reverting to fear? Can you sit with the expanded identity without shrinking back into past narratives? Consider the image of a muscle being strengthened. Growth occurs through tension followed by recovery. If recovery is denied, injury follows. Many approach prosperity through relentless tension without allowing integration. They accumulate knowledge, strategies, and opportunities, but do not integrate them into identity. Integration demands reflection and emotional recalibration. Without it, expansion feels foreign. Allowing prosperity is not surrendering ambition. It is stabilizing identity so that growth does not fracture the psyche. It involves acknowledging hidden fears about power, influence, and permanence. It means recognizing that discomfort during expansion is not evidence of misalignment, but evidence of transformation. When the nervous system learns that growth does not equal danger, internal resistance decreases. In that softened state, decisions shift from reactive to intentional. Opportunities are not grasped from desperation, but engaged with clarity. Financial movement becomes less about proving worth and more about expressing coherence. Prosperity then ceases to be an external pursuit. It becomes a natural extension of an identity that has expanded enough to hold it without collapsing back into survival. True financial expansion rarely begins with numbers. It begins with space. Not physical space, but internal space. Many people attempt to add more income, more projects, more strategies, while their inner world remains crowded with unresolved narratives, quiet resentment, and subtle self-doubt. Prosperity cannot stabilize in a psyche that is overloaded with contradiction. When the internal environment is saturated with tension, any external gain must compete with emotional noise. There are subtle indicators of misalignment that often go unnoticed. A persistent sense of urgency, even when circumstances are stable. An inability to rest without guilt. A reflexive expectation that something will go wrong just as progress begins. These are not random thoughts. They are traces of a nervous system conditioned to anticipate disruption. The body, trained in vigilance, struggles to interpret calm as safe. In that state, financial growth feels fragile, almost temporary. Silence becomes uncomfortable for those accustomed to survival. When activity slows, unresolved beliefs surface. Thoughts about worth, competence, and comparison emerge with greater clarity. Many unconsciously avoid this internal exposure by staying busy. Yet busyness can be another form of avoidance. Prosperity, especially sustainable prosperity, requires the ability to sit with oneself without immediate distraction. In that stillness, patterns reveal themselves. The relationship between effort and outcome must also recalibrate. For years, effort may have been equated with exhaustion. The deeper the fatigue, the more legitimate the reward seemed. However, this equation conditions the psyche to distrust ease. If something arrives without suffering, it may feel undeserved or unstable. Allowing prosperity involves redefining effort as precision rather than strain. It involves recognizing that strategic alignment often produces more than compulsive overexertion. Regulation of the nervous system plays a central role. When the body remains in sympathetic activation, fight or flight, decisions are reactive. Financial choices made in that state tend to prioritize immediate relief over long-term coherence. In contrast, when the system is regulated, perception broadens, options expand. The mind can evaluate opportunity without the distortion of urgency. In this regulated state, allowing becomes tangible. It is no longer abstract, it is physiological. There is also a rhythmic dimension to prosperity that mirrors nature. Seasons of planting, seasons of growth, seasons of integration. Modern culture often demands constant acceleration, but sustainable financial flow respects cycles. Integration is frequently overlooked. Without integration, gains feel unstable because identity has not caught up with circumstance. When income increases but self-concept remains rooted in scarcity, internal friction intensifies. Integration is the gradual normalization of expansion. Consider the metaphor of a house long closed, windows sealed, air stagnant. Introducing fresh air requires opening space gradually. If forced abruptly, discomfort arises. Internal expansion operates similarly. As beliefs shift and safety increases, space forms. In that space, opportunities circulate more freely. There is less internal obstruction. Thoughts become clearer, decisions more deliberate. Allowing prosperity ultimately means permitting oneself to experience stability without anticipating loss. It means recognizing that financial flow is not sustained through anxiety but through coherence. Coherence between values, actions, and emotional state. When internal clutter diminishes, perception sharpens. Patterns that once triggered fear now appear as information. Opportunities that once felt overwhelming become manageable. As internal space expands, the compulsion to prove diminishes. Financial growth no longer serves as validation, but as expression. The difference is subtle, yet profound. Validation seeks external confirmation of worth. Expression arises from established worth. When prosperity becomes expression rather than compensation, it stabilizes. It no longer needs to fluctuate to reaffirm identity. In this expanded inner environment, allowing is not passive waiting. It is structured openness. It is the quiet confidence that growth can be held without self-sabotage. And within that openness, financial flow becomes less volatile, less dramatic, and more consistent. Not because effort ceased, but because resistance softened. The space that once resisted expansion now sustains it. Prosperity has never been a moral verdict on your value. It has never been a cosmic reward distributed after sufficient struggle. What this journey reveals is something far more intimate. Financial flow mirrors internal coherence. When effort is driven by self-doubt, outcomes fluctuate. When ambition is fueled by fear of inadequacy, success feels fragile. But when identity expands beyond survival, prosperity stabilizes because it no longer threatens the nervous system. You have seen that the true barrier was not lack of discipline, intelligence, or opportunity. It was the subtle conditioning that equated growth with danger and ease with vulnerability. The body rehearsed tension for so long that calm felt suspicious. The mind chased results while resisting the identity required to sustain them. And yet, the shift was never about doing more. It was about becoming internally spacious enough to hold more without collapsing. Allowing does not mean surrendering standards. It means releasing self-punishment as a strategy for success. It means recognizing that coherence between thought, emotion, and physiology creates a stable internal environment where opportunity can land and remain. Prosperity becomes less dramatic, less chaotic, and more consistent when it is no longer used to compensate for hidden insecurities. In the end, the question is not whether you deserve abundance. The question is whether you are willing to inhabit the version of yourself who can remain grounded while receiving it. Now consider this carefully. If financial stability no longer threatened your identity, what would change in the way you move, decide, and envision your future? Reflect on that honestly. If this message resonated with you and expanded your perspective, subscribe to the channel so you continue strengthening this internal coherence. There is more depth waiting for you. And on the final screen, continue watching the next video, where we explore how identity transformation solidifies long-term prosperity beyond temporary results.